raped woman needs to appear distressed or as a bechari in court in order to be able to be recognized and therefore to be able to get or be understood as deserving of restitution. In fact, women are not appearing in that way in court. We saw this, for example, in the Shakti Mills case, right, of the young woman who said, "I'm no longer a zinda lash." My name is Rupal Oza. I teach in the Women and Gender Studies department at Hunter College. As a geographer, I was trained to think about gender in space. And much of my work over the last 20 years or so has been about looking at the relationship between gender, political economy, and violence in particular places. So I think about what happens in place and space through scales, the local, the national, the global. Many other women, including the young women that I spoke with, are understanding themselves not entirely defined by the act of violation, but of course understand themselves in other ways. And what that is doing, what that they are demanding, is that they be recognized as complex, as full, as different. And as a consequence of that demand, of a different form of recognition, what they are also unfurling, what they're also making happen slowly and in incredibly small incremental ways is a shift in the structures that recognize them, whether it is courts, whether it is families, whether it is the panchayat, whether it is the village, whether it is the mahila thanas, whether it is the law itself. They are asking for a change in the ways in which they get to be defined as subjects. My book, The Semiotics of Rape, Sexual Subjectivity and Violation in Rural India, emerged in the wake of several fairly atrocious rape cases that came out of both UP and Haryana. From Haryana was the Bhagana case, and hundreds of the victims and their families from Bhagana came to Jantar Mantar in Delhi and were here for several weeks. And part of the story that emerged from Bhagana was about a relationship between caste, land, and rape. So rural Haryana became the site of my investigations. The word semiotics emerged from or came out of a different word, the word script that I use in the book. One of the first times I went to Haryana, the first few days, it was early in spring, perhaps late March, and I went to sort of the commissioner of the police in one of the districts. And I went into his office, a huge office with a large desk, ACs running, cool against what was beginning to be a very hot summer. And I asked him about rape. And the first thing he said to me was, rape cases farji hain. Rape cases are false. So I was not surprised to hear it, but I heard him. And then when I began to further investigate and talk to various other people, I heard that narrative, that story, that script, that things are farji, that rape is farji over and over again by constables, by women in the mahila thanas, the officers in the mahila thanas, by attorneys, by sometimes even judges, by members of the panchayat, sometimes members of the village themselves, sometimes members of the family as well. And so as I kept hearing it over and over and over again, I began to understand this narrative, this story about the fact that rape cases are false as a script which I mean to say that which is audible, that which is hearable, that which falls on to an audience in a way that is recognizable. The focus of the book is on that which is not audible, that which is not heard oftentimes. So the inaudible parts of the stories of rape cases that I excavate are those things that the women themselves say about how they understand the violation on which that their cases are based and what they have to say about them. So let me again begin with the story of Bhagana. In Bhagana, obviously I did not get to talk with the women that were raped or allegedly raped because they had left the village, but I talked to their mothers. One of the women that I spoke with, that I called Savitri, had this to say about why she compromised. And she said, it is not that we left the Andolan, we did not leave the protest, rather the state abandoned us. So in the subtitle of my book, I use the word sexual subjectivity, and I differentiate that from agency. A term agency is well worn and recognized within feminist movements everywhere, but I differentiate it from agency because I think of agency primarily has been understood and utilized about the capacity for women to make choices. Subjectivity is different. So in the book, what I'm exploring and what I'm listening for is about the ways in which women make meaning of their life through contradiction, through dispute, through challenges, through refusals, through compromise, through consent. How is it that women understand themselves and understand the trajectory and story about this story of violation that has been either done to them or created or other kinds of things? So subjectivity is a more expansive term. It's a term that sort of has the ability and capacity to include a wider set of things and ways in which that women make meaning. So let me begin with a story of a young woman I call Vinita. Vinita is a young Dalit woman who is in a relationship with Pradeep, a Jat man. The relationship was obviously not acceptable in the village, etc. Now, her family, when they discovered that she was in this relationship, forced her to file a rape charge. So the audible part of this is that impermissible relationships end up as a rape charge. But what was inaudible about her story was that she consented to this relationship. At the same time, when the relationship ended, when the rape charge was filed, she also consented and very much wanted the compromise because she did not want Pradeep to go to jail. At the same time, didn't also want to continue her relationship with him. So the inaudible parts of the stories of rape cases that I excavate are those things that the women themselves say about how they understand the violation on which that their cases are based and what they have to say about them. Every conversation that I had, even when it was about rape cases, but also about other things, literally talked about land. Whether it was amongst the court people, whether it was amongst families, land emerged in the background and or directly. The Bhagana case, at least in the media, etc., was about these 4 girls from the Dalit community that were raped by dominant caste men and were found at the Bhatinda railway station several miles away. But what was the story that intrigued me was the fact that the case of this violation was tied to a story of conflict between Dalits and the dominant castes over land, actually over a Shamlat Zameen, a common land. And it is that story of land and the ways in which it is tied to violence that intrigued me. Dalits own only 2% of land, whereas the majority of land is amongst the dominant castes. In order to understand why the story of land is so important for me to understand rape, one has to go back to understanding the political economy of Haryana. Now, Haryana's growth in terms of the wealth of the state emerges after the Green Revolution, the Hari Kranti in the 60s and 70s. A state that was very poor during the British colonial period, after the Green Revolution emerges as a profoundly wealthy state, incredibly wealthy. And in that time period, those of dominant caste, those that owned land, made a tremendous amount of money and consequently from that garnered an enormous amount of power. However, by the 1980s and particularly into the 1990s, the wealth that was coming out of agriculture begins to rapidly decline. The dominance that and the sort of political prominence that Jats had during the period after Green Revolution begins to come down. Now, what has also emerged is during that same period, sort of state government and federal government regulations and affirmative actions, reservations that were created for subordinate and Dalit castes, people from these castes begin to avail of these services and these programs. The consequence of which is that they get a modicum of upward mobility. They join service. Some of them become parts of police officers or other kinds of things. So during the period of both Jat decline in the 80s and 90s, you also have a simultaneous modicum of increase in the living standards of those of subordinate castes. However, many of the villages that I went to, much of the common land had been taken over. Kabza Karod had sort of been used up by those that are dominant castes. So when these government schemes were put forward to give housing to those that were unhoused, those that were poor, that were living in dilapidated places, it angered those that were dominant castes because they all claimed that the Shamalat Zameen, the common land, is their ancestral property that they had gifted to the village, and so were unwilling to give the land to those that they considered undeserving, and they considered those that were lesser than them. Now, when you have Dalits and those of subordinate caste using that land or having claims to that land given by government schemes, it angers them. The manner in which that anger is expressed is over women's bodies. The violation of subordinate caste women is a violation of the community. It is the manner in which the violation of and the subordination of a community is expressed. Dalit scholars, activists, feminists, and others have talked about it for many years. One of the other ways in which the story of land emerged in rape cases was a different script. And the script was that the rape case is false because it's actually a dispute over land. And it's the use of a criminal case to expedite a civil claim. And the way that land emerged in that was a rape case is falsely filed in order to resolve, solve, or expedite a civil dispute between property. Compromise is what Pratiksha Bakshi calls a public secret, but which is practiced with mundane regularity. Our understanding of compromise is that it shouldn't happen, right? When a crime has been committed, when somebody has had a violation occur, We want justice to look like where it goes to the court system and the perpetrator is punished. Now, while that was the way I began my research, I also found that as I talked to more people, in particular to the victim and her family, in some cases, the victims themselves were pushing for compromise. And that really perplexed me. In the Bhagana case, one of the women's mother, a woman I called Savitri, and Savitri said they wanted the compromise, or at least they agreed to it, uncomfortably even perhaps, because of two things. One, a younger daughter of hers needed to get married. And second, she said to me, "Bhains bandi hai gaam mein." My buffaloes are tied in the village. Both of those statements I understood as being the ways in which she is compromising with the circumstances of her life in order to continue, in order to carry on, in order to make sense in the aftermath of what had happened to her family. So compromise needs to be understood in ways that are complementary, contradictory, also about a refusal to continue with the circumstances and trying to figure out a different way to live their life. So many of the times, the thing that occurred to me is that people didn't ask these women what they thought, right? What was their sense of what had happened to them, or what was their sense of what they thought would be justice? And I think we need to ask what they think. They are sophisticated and mature and incredibly profound in the ways in which they understand the world around them, and they deserve their voices.